Well, carrying on a little bit with the theme from yesterday, as we were thinking about kind of World War II history. 1939, when the war started, this particular building was used as a resource hub for materials, for supplies, for rations, for community centres and community hubs right around the city, right around Greater Manchester. In 1941, a bomb was dropped directly on this building, and the whole place was utterly gutted in a raging fire, which meant that for the duration of the rest of the war, the whole building was taken out of action. And this building actually, originally on the site, was a chapel built by John Wesley, wasn't rebuilt until the early 1950s. You can see the pictures of that experience when we came up the stairs. But actually, I think it's appropriate that we gather together as representatives of churches from different places as we think about what it means to resource beyond our own borders in a building that was designed in the fiercest conflict to resource, support, and help right across the Greater Manchester area. And in the spirit of that, what I thought would be helpful before we dive into the presentations was to give you something to think about, to stimulate some thoughts, to offer you some reflections of things that we've learnt here in Manchester, but challenge you, and hopefully the goal is to stimulate your thinking about your own churches back in the US and how you might continue to position yourselves, shape yourselves for ongoing, healthy, thriving gospel ministry. For me, it's an example really of the heart of what good partnership looks like. It's certainly not one way, but I think the best partnerships are two ways. Sharing knowledge, insight, resources together, going both ways. They're the types of partnerships we thrive on at City Church. And actually, over the next few minutes together, I wanted to give us all a little bit of a taste of that hopefully you will find helpful. So let me pray, and then we'll begin. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the time that we've been able to spend together. Thank you for the safe arrival of everyone yesterday. And we pray that the rest that you've given us last night would be sufficient for us to engage with all of the different presentations that will be happening this morning. We thank you for your answered prayers that we petitioned you yesterday, that we would be deepening relationships and affection for one another. And I certainly experienced that last night, and I hope we as a group did too. And we pray that that spirit of friendship would continue, that spirit of encouragement, that spirit of standing side by side together in meaningful partnership would be a theme of our time together this morning. Amen. All of us are somehow involved in the ministries of multiplicating churches. Now, that may well be church revitalizations. That could be direct churches that your church has planted. That could be through the UK partnership, supporting churches that are planting in other parts of the UK. But you wouldn't be here unless you had a particular interest in multiplying churches throughout the world. And one of the things that I think that we've learned at City Church, we're a 7-year-old church, and we're kind of cranking through the different gears of church life and experience, is there is an absolute health that established churches receive just by being in relationship with church plants and with new church revitalizations. Again, it is never just a one-way thing where you give support or expertise to them and don't receive anything back. Actually, I want to identify 3 particular things that established churches like you receive in benefit from working with church plants, revitalizations, new gospel works. Now, there are loads of different things, absolutely loads of different things that churches receive back from supporting new ministries. But I wanted to identify for you 3 that I think established churches really need to pay attention to. Okay? They may be a little bit different from other sessions along a similar theme that you've had, and I think they're vital, and I'm hoping it's going to stimulate your thoughts. I'm hoping as we talk about various examples that I'll be sharing, I want you to be, in your mind, going back to your churches that you have come from and thinking through, well, how does that apply to us? What is the lesson that we need to take from this? Is there a way that we need to pay attention to this? And the first one is this. See your community with fresh eyes. See your community with fresh eyes. That's our first slide up there. Church plants have a vested interest in spending time more than almost any other church in its kind of growth cycle. Church plants spend more time, they invest more time getting to know the community in which they're looking to root themselves. They are identifying the best place to actually put their church, either the building or where the group is going to meet. They're researching the demographics, who lives there, where do people go, which areas do we need to think about for this particular evangelistic strategy, or which particular area do we need to look for this one. Now, all churches will do that ongoingly to some extent, but church plants, more than any other church in the cycle of church growth and life, church plants do that more. Church plants do that more proficiently. Church plants do that more ongoingly, ruthlessly. And part of the reason for that is if you are new to an area because you've been drawn there because you have a heart to see the gospel go out, you are in the posture of learning. You're in the posture of finding out more. You're in the posture of not being the expert. And therefore, you're having to be schooled by the people in the area, get the data in order to make the decisions that you need in order to thrive as a plant. What typically tends to happen as churches actually become more established is they start making assumptions that they know the community. They tend to see the community as a little bit more static, a little bit more fixed. They kind of will have maybe lived in the area for a while, and so the assumptions they tend to make about who is there, who's moving in, the type of interests or values that people have, again, the research will be less, the assumption will be increased. And the problem with that is often the assumptions that we make about the communities that we live in and the communities that our churches are rooted in are often out of date. The world is changing faster than ever before. And if we base our church strategy and tactics upon the assumptions that we had in the initial phase when the church was planted or grown, then we're likely to find ourselves very quickly out of touch. Now, one of the ways to think about that for us here who represent more established churches is to think about the question of mapping. Think about the question of mapping. You see, maps we tend to think of as representations of spaces or directional guides. You want to get from A to B, you'll get the map out, you'll get your sat-nav on the phone, you'll look at Google Maps, and you will use a map for that reason. But actually, there is a whole body of research on mapping for community-centric groups that churches are included in that very few churches take advantage of, which means that we cede the opportunity and the benefits that other non-church groups have because we assume that we know. The researcher Ingold wrote that maps are actually condensed histories. More than directional spaces, they are condensed histories. That if you want to understand the present, it's going back to the idea you have to understand the past. And so maps, in the mapping theory, are more than directional. They are deeply political. They are often personal. They are sometimes emotional. And they are an opportunity for us not merely to know what is precisely where, but they are an insight into how people think, which always, when we pull that thread, leads us to a better understanding of how to communicate the gospel with greater level of precision and accuracy to those around us. I talk about mapping because my wife is a PhD in music, but she specializes particularly in anthropology. And she was doing a mapping project right here in the Manchester city centre area, in the Ancoats area, in the New Islington area where the church was based. She happened to get the project just as we were establishing City Church in its very first year back in 2014. And the project was simply this. She asked hundreds of people from the local community to draw a map of their area, just on a small piece of paper. They could draw anything they wanted. They could write anything they wanted. It was to be their map of their understanding of the area. She went to local schools, got the kids to do it. She went to the kind of senior citizens' homes and got them to do it. She walked the streets and surveyed hundreds of people. She came to our staff team in our first year and said, there are things that you need to know about this community based on analysis of the maps that I've got in from the community. I'll give you an example of a couple of them which are really helpful for us. Older people, say those who are 60 plus, refused to draw factories on their maps. Now, if you've spent any time walking around, even a little bit of Manchester, there's factories everywhere. They're converted into restaurants, coffee shops, mainly flats, but they are everywhere. Over 60s refuse to write them on their maps, refuse to note them down. Isn't that interesting? When they were pushed a little bit about why the case was that they weren't including them, they were like, our parents, our grandparents, their parents grew up, worked life to the bone in those horrific places. They are not places of leisure. They are not places of celebration. Why would we want to mark them on our maps? We don't go there. They are of the past. That was important for us because all of our branding as a brand new church was all about industrial architecture, industrial textures, feel, typefaces, because actually, if you were between 20 to 35, all of your maps included factories. You love the coffee shops in the old factory buildings. You love the exposed walls, brickwork. You love the oldness of it, which is why we thought brilliant for our church. But we made choices based on assumption because what was good for us actually wasn't good for a whole swathe of our community. Huge error because we just made assumptions that what we liked, everyone would like. Another example, interestingly, of mapping is certain families. You know, in any community, there are pockets where there are particularly families living. Families from one area would not draw roads that were literally 2 to 3 minutes walk from their homes. Isn't that interesting? They might draw other roads that might be 10 to 15 minutes, but there were some key roads in their community that they did not write on the map. They did not draw. They did not mention. Why? Because actually for a whole number of communities, it is never as practical as thinking, well, I live 2 minutes from this or 5 minutes from this. It's no, this is the street I know. That street is the street where I have friends. That's the street that I walk down all the time. That street isn't safe. That street isn't even on my radar. Now, that was absolutely vital for us because we were thinking about running a children's community outreach in one of the streets in a building that was not on any of the maps that families had. And of course, we're moving into an area assuming, well, if we just draw a map on the flyer, everyone will go there. No. If you're a visitor, you'll do that. If you're a local, chances are you won't. It's not on your map. It's not in your community. Jackie spent a lot of her time actually doing mapping in Liverpool. And Steve and the team's here. Hey, Steve, welcome. One of the interesting things on that, there are parts of Liverpool historically where one side of the road is Catholic, the other side of the road is Protestant. You put a church event on the wrong side of the road, you're isolating half your community. Now, if you're a visitor, if you're an outsider, well, it's a no-brainer. It's just across the road. Just across the road. Now, that is an assumption. That will kill your ministries dead. Church plants invest disproportionate amount of time and energy and resources learning. The posture of learning, not assuming. And actually, I think all of us as established churches, and I include that as City Church, only 7 years in, we need to think of that again, because the situation, the life, the communities are changing all the time. And if our assumptions for what our community makeup, accessibility, is the same as what it was when the church was planted or established or had its key time of growth, then we are not ready for the future. We are not ready for the future. A couple of other interesting things to note with mapping. Next slide, please. This is from a website called Audience Finder. This isn't a Christian website. This takes data for people who go to any events, okay, in a particular geographical area. It breaks them down into different colors, which they kind of give you a key for. It tells you where they went, what they did, how much they were willing to spend, which areas of the city they went to. It tells you where they parked. It gives you all sorts of data that actually, if you knew that about where your church was located, I think you would find absolutely fascinating. This is one specifically for the UK, but there are these websites that are across Europe, and I'm sure even across the US, that actually churches have access to this data. This was all free, but actually we have never tapped into it, and yet we're running events all the time blind. When we could actually have a better understanding of how to reach out, how to communicate, where even to locate things. We're missing that. Maps are, again, more sophisticated than simply directional places. Next slide, please. This is a map of a place called Dolores Park. This is an individual map. It's called an emotions map. This is one particular person that mapped in their community how different parts of their community actually made them feel. I wonder if you've ever heard of a map like that. The different colors on the map mark the different emotions associated with those different locations, different parts of the streets, all sorts of things like that. They've noted here some of their kind of key memories in those different parts of their community. And that's interesting to think of an emotion map and what that might mean for a particular individual, but how do you scale that up? Next slide, please. This is a more popular mapping version that's coming out. You can't quite see it here, but I'll update the PowerPoint onto the app. You can see it more clearly. This is a map of Stockport. It's an emotion map. This represents a survey of hundreds of people who live in this part of Stockport and has collated their emotional feelings attached to different parts of the city. Isn't that interesting? Imagine if you found out your church was associated in your community with a particular emotional feeling. It'd be wonderful if it was good. It'd be tragic if it was bad. Isn't that interesting? What people are marking there is safe places to go, places that they want to go, places that they don't feel safe, places that they have nothing to do with, places that actually raise the energy levels that they have. If you knew that for your community, wouldn't that be interesting, some of the choices that you could therefore begin to make? We're talking precision here. We make too many assumptions. So a couple of applications really for us on that one. Churches shouldn't assume they know their community simply by walking around them. It's a good start, but it's very limited. Long-established churches should not assume that their communities and the way people see their communities has not changed over the years. That is an absolute recipe for disaster. Maps are living things. They are not static. They are as up-to-date as a photograph of a crowded street. Isn't that something that we need to pay attention to? If you go out now, the photo is as redundant as the moment it was taken. Many of the great military disasters, actually, in world history have occurred because those in leadership have made incorrect assumptions based on incorrect intelligence. You know, we were at Patton's HQ last night, and he was heading up the diversion for the Nazis with the inflatable tanks and all of that. The Germans thought that the big attack was actually coming after D-Day in Calais, and so they'd hold back a number of their resources for them, absolute tragedy on the battlefield. We mustn't make assumptions that lead us to squander our resources or put our churches into weaker positions. I guess the take-home for you to think about is, why not map your congregation? We need to be less interested in a time where people are mobile. We need to be less interested in some senses in geography, but more interested in actually where people frequent. It would be fascinating if you surveyed your congregation, not where they merely lived, but what were the coffee shops they go to? What are the bus stops they wait at? What are the restaurants they enjoy going to? What are the cinemas that they frequent? Because if you can start actually mapping how your church community uses your environment, uses your town or your city, it then gives you, again, a number of options that you wouldn't have had for putting on events or thinking about this or changing the way that you do things there. It is about knowing your wider community, but it's also about knowing your own church community. You won't do that unless you map them in a way that's far more sophisticated than the postcode or the zip code in which they live. Number two, this is the second thing I think that established churches can learn from church plants, and that is to see selective experiences as key. See selective experiences as key. Church plants tend to recognize that selecting certain key experiences of the church service is more impactful than trying to make every aspect of the church service excellent. Let me say that again. Church plants understand that selecting key moments of the church service to be excellent is more impactful than trying to make everything excellent. That sounds a little bit strange and counterintuitive, doesn't it? But church plants, they know they do not have the manpower or resources to make every aspect from people's arrival to their leaving kind of absolutely five-star review. They do not have the people for that. They do not have the money. It's normally kind of pretty hand-to-mouth, scrabbling together to get everything going, ready for the first people to arrive. So what they do is they select certain moments, certain key moments in the church service experience, which is the flagship event for all of us, and they specialize in making those key events excellent. What more established churches do as they get more resources and energy and expertise, they tend to try and raise the game for everything to be excellent, which ends up making everything fairly average. There were a bunch of researchers, and they did this to a business community, so you'll have to translate it a little bit, but I still think it's helpful. A bunch of researchers asked the question, if you could take all of your one-star reviews, they were talking particularly to people in the service industry, people in the hotel industry, if you could take all of your one-star reviews and make them three-star reviews, just with a magic wand, click of the fingers, would you do it? Or, if you had the opportunity to make all of your four-star reviews five-star reviews, would you choose that? You could only do one or the other. Most people actually said, well, hands down, it's going to be easy. We would go for all of our one-star reviews, make them three-star reviews. Well, you know, everyone who's complaining, they had a terrible time, that's who we really, really need to work on. We just need to get them up to three-star. That would be wonderful. The researchers from a business perspective said, no, it's a total waste of resources. If the five-star people have a five-star experience, they will return. Three-star experiences is like, yeah, I'll try somewhere else next week anyway. Really, it makes no difference. Now that, I think, is something that's interesting for us to think about, because we've got finite energy, finite ideas, finite resources, finite amount of time. As much as we think as established churches, every single aspect of our service we can make 5-star, we really can't. We really can't. Things are changing too fast, too quickly. What was 5-star last year is no longer. Actually, it's the selective choice of key events to say, actually, this may not be as great as we would love it. We'll work on that. But this event here, this particular part of our service, actually, if we can improve that to be outstanding, that will make the biggest difference in terms of visitor retention or even member encouragement, whatever it is that we think is particularly important at the time. The application question for us, I think, is this. Which aspect of your church service do you do well, but with a bit more investment or energy or resource, you could move from good to outstanding? You know, what does that mean for your particular church community? We would love for every bit to be brilliant, but in the knowledge that's just not possible, if we could move something from good to excellent, what would that be for you? I think that's an interesting question for us to consider. The researchers Chip and Dan Heath argue that the most significant and memorable moments for people, they did a whole bunch of research, were beginnings, endings, and transitions. What church plants specialize in is they specialize in beginnings, endings, and transitions. What do I mean by that? Normally, because a church plant is smaller, but with a higher proportion of the core team excited, on vision, ready to welcome, when people come through the door of a church plant, you know, there's 5 people who just kind of gang in on them and welcome them and throw a coffee in their hand and play with their kids and say hi. When they're leaving, really only church plants have the opportunity, because of the size, for the church pastor or the senior staff team to actually get around and actually speak and have not just hi, nice to meet you, but a proper conversation with a significant percentage of visitors that arrive. That gives them a running advantage when it comes to beginnings, endings, and transitions. What do I mean by transitions? Well, if you think a number of people moving to a new church, perhaps they're leaving an old church. That's an emotional move. It's a big deal, trying out a new church that you've been established in. Perhaps it's a transition from not going to any church and then deciding, actually, life has changed. COVID's happened. I need to explore spiritual things. I haven't been to church maybe for 20 years. But I'm going to start. We had a lady like that the other week. She was abused by a pastor 20 years ago as a 10-year-old, hadn't been to church. Over COVID this summer, she felt that God was telling her to read the Bible. So she did. She opened up, Genesis can get into it, opened up Mark's Gospel, read it, became a Christian, put a trust in Jesus. She said, the next thing I knew I needed to do, although it was the hardest thing in the world, is I knew I needed to find a church community. I found yours online. It was in a street that I knew because I know about Affleck's, which is the shop across the way, and so I came. That's the mapping, isn't it? That's a huge transition, huge transition. What church plants are typically able to do that more established churches are not is, if you were to take a woman like that, going through that transition, church plants are more likely to be able to have a conversation with that woman, sit down with her, with a kind of trained or experienced member of staff, than a more established church, which may pick her up, but actually in a large crowd are less likely to. Gives them a very big advantage with beginnings, endings, transitions. I think it's something to think about when we are reflecting on the lessons that we we can take from church plants. And these are some of the rich things that we've enjoyed because we are a church planting church. We work with lots of church planters. And so at City, we are constantly getting this kind of feedback and data back, and it's enriching us. And I'm sure for those of you who are very involved in working with new churches or new church projects, it's similar for you. But more established churches tend to think comfort equals a higher level of experience. The more comfortable we make it, the more likely we are to create a 5-star church experience, whatever that might be. Actually, the research suggests that's not necessarily the case. Researchers put together an experiment where they took a tank of water and they put a puzzle at the bottom of it, a fairly straightforward puzzle, but it would take some time, that they had to put their hands in the water and assemble it. And they had a group of people watching other people take their turns to do it. The group that put their hands in fairly warm water, comfortable, not boiling, not cold, did the puzzle. When they reviewed them, their connection with each other was far lower. Their enjoyment of the experience was far lower than the group that had to assemble the puzzle in freezing, ice-cold water. Why? Because discomfort, challenge, endurance, the things that church plants often specialize in, but more established churches do their very best to eradicate, is actually the thing that has this amazing ability of bonding people together and heightening a level of camaraderie, that band of brothers experience, that sense of getting involved. How might this look like in a particular church situation? Speaking as a pastor who's very much involved in kind of setting up church every Sunday, setting it down, longing that we had our own building, that we could just switch the lights on and press the power. What I have to learn from this is when visitors arrive at City Church and they are helping stack the chairs, wind up the cables, carry the boxes of Bibles, help out with the hospitality because we've got to flip the room back. What I think is a pain in the backside actually heightens people's level of involvement, engagement, sense of, and here's the word, belonging. And yet, I totally get it because I'm the same. The quest for most of us as staff members on senior staff teams is to eradicate discomfort at all cost wherever we find it, under the belief that it will make the experience for everyone infinitely better. Maybe it will, but that is not a given, and so we have to be very careful with that assumption. Church plants get that. Whereas established churches, I think we've got something to learn from it. It's more nuanced. I'm not saying that we should make things hard just for the sake of it, but it's much more nuanced. I guess a question for us to think about is how could you heighten the quality of the end or the transition experiences of your church? What might that look like for you to improve those peaks? Some research that Chip and Dan Heath did that was absolutely fascinating was they researched Disneyland, and they found that if you surveyed an average family at Disneyland over the course of a whole day, I guess lots of us would have been to Disneyland, out of 10, the average enjoyment factor is 6.5. That's at Disneyland. Supreme place in the world for entertainment, leisure, and enjoyment. 6.5 out of 10. That's the average. Interesting. What is more interesting, that 90% of people surveyed days after their Disneyland trip would reflect a rating of 9 for their time in the park. 9. You average them on the day, it's 6.5. Retrospectively, it's 9 out of 10. Why? Because what Disneyland figured out is if you make people's beginnings brilliant, if you give them a great peak, which for those of you who are interested in Disney, it's normally Space Mountain. But most importantly, if you give people a strong finish, which is why they always take you through Main Street, always take you with the parades at the end of the day when people are going. They will do everything they can to get you with your kids having the kind of mouse ears shot before you leave the park. That, whatever your final score is as you leave the park, is the biggest determiner of the score that you will have as you reflect back on the whole day's experience. Beginnings, transitions, endings. What would it take for your church, in the interests of retention, welcome, engagement, to improve the endings of your church experience? Just take 2 minutes with those people on your tables, and I'd love you just to chat. What could you do to improve the final experiences at your average Sunday church service? Go. Okay, let's pull together. Hopefully you've had some stimulating conversation there, some ideas coming through. Again, what I'm trying to do for us this morning is to demonstrate that actually it's not a trade-off in the sense of you invest in church plants or revitalizations or hub churches at the detriment of your own church. Actually, I think this is part of the key to actually enhancing and helping your own church to thrive in the 21st century challenges. Okay, it's not a trade-off, what we're talking about. Actually, the value added of gaining some of this experience is huge for us. So the third and final lesson that I think established churches can learn from church plants is see church as an infinite game. See church as an infinite game. Now that sounds perhaps a little bit obvious in the sense of, Revelation 7, we've got that picture of the global church surrounding the throne, praising God with every tribe, nation, language, every tongue. It's wonderful. It's the church praising God forever. We know that, don't we? We know that. The church is going on. It is the ongoing hope for our world. I'm talking about that slightly differently, though, in this session. Because you can use that mindset, that picture of Revelation 7, every tribe, tongue, and nation, to either say, we need to make massive risks and really push out and gather in as many people we can from across the world. The people who aren't with us, we need to stretch ourselves and our resources to do it very best we can so they might be worshipping with us in that great moment. Equally, you can take that same passage and think of it in, well, if we want to be there in Revelation 7, we need to batten down the hatches, we need to strengthen the doors, we need to protect ourselves, we need to build higher walls, we need to be much more careful with our resources so we don't run out, okay? We need to be more protectionist if we want to be there. So you can play it either way. You can play it either way, and churches tend to play it either way, depending on their personality. But what I'm talking about here with an infinite game is something a little bit different that I'll explain. One of the key thinkers on this is the writer Simon Sinek, which some of you may well have read some of his leadership books. He notes that he was invited to two workshops, a bit like this, where different people would present their ideas to their companies and get feedback. He was invited to one at Microsoft to sit in and observe, and he was invited to one of these conferences at Apple. He noticed the difference between the two conferences and the two sets of presentations he heard. He noted that at Microsoft, 80% of presentations mentioned how this idea or that strategy meant that they were going to beat Apple in the next quarter or by the end of the year. 100% of Apple presentations never mentioned Microsoft. They just talked about what they were going to do for education, or healthcare, or information sharing. And he said, actually, that is, for him, a really telling difference between organizations and leaderships that play a finite game and those that play an infinite game. So let me explain the difference between the two. A finite game is where you have a set of rules that everyone's agreed, a set of players that everyone knows, and the goal is to win. The goal is to totally win. An infinite game, in contrast, there is no fixed set of rules because the rules are always changing. The players are unknown. And the goal is not to win, but to keep playing. And Simon Sinek's point was this: if you have a finite mindset in your leadership team, but you are playing in an infinite gamed world, you will always get rolled over. You will always get rolled over. So, for example, he talks about in armed conflict, a Western military with all of their resources, power, expertise, and might normally fight with a finite mindset. They've got a key objective, they've got a key win, they've got this amount of budget to spend, it's got to be won by this point in the political calendar, and we can only afford this amount of collateral damage. Whereas if you fight guerrilla insurgents or religiously motivated armies, they are playing a finite game. They have no budgets. They have no timetable that they have to win by. They have no casualty threshold by which point, when it exceeds it, they're out. Their goal is to survive for as long as possible and to keep playing the game, which is why Western military will often find itself coming second when it takes on groups that do not think in the same way as them. So in terms of leadership examples, another one you would have is, the famous one of Blockbuster Video, when they totally rejected Netflix and the idea there to come on board and be part of Blockbuster when they were a tiny startup. That is the issue of finite thinking, because what Netflix was saying is, look, the rules have changed, and Blockbuster were going, no, they haven't. Netflix saying, we're new players. No, you're not. This is for the future. If we can invest in the next 10, 15, 20 years, it's going to totally change the game. Actually, we've got our quarterly OKRs and objectives. That's what we need to hit. We're out. So what might that look like in a church setting, really? Well, I think infinite-minded churches are churches that... have we got a slide up there on that one? It's a comparison slide. Let me say finite churches, they take the short view. What that means often is only growth is acceptable. They do not have a language for contraction. There is no way you can contract as a church without that causing total panic. The only way forward is up. The only healthy way is faster, bigger, stronger. That is a finite mindset, because actually, in comparison, an infinite mindset is the long view. You know that when you're playing the long game, there will be seasons of growth, but there will also be seasons of contraction. We don't need to panic. We don't need to panic. It's okay. That's just life. It's the good and the bad. Finite mindsets within churches often looks at failure weakens through loss. We don't have a space for failure, because the loss of whatever that failure would mean would be too much to bear, too much disadvantage, too much pain. Whereas actually, for a more infinitely minded church, failure strengthens the organization. Failure strengthens the leadership, because there is a greater level of institutional learning. For those of you who like computer games, you get more experience points with failure than you do victory. And if you're playing the long game, it's experience points that you need, not short-term victories. Finite-minded churches tend to have an intentional pursuit of tried and tested ideas. This is what we've done. This is what we've seen work. This is what we pursue. Whereas infinite-minded churches tend to have an intentional scrutiny of trends and disruptors. Now, hear me right on that one, an intentional scrutiny. I'm not saying they are just absorbing all new trends and new ideas without a filter, without discernment. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that they are intentionally, deliberately scrutinizing new things on the horizon and asking the question, is that a gospel opportunity? Is that a gospel threat? Does this mean that we need to change or pivot? Finite-minded churches tend to have a low pain threshold for long-term strategy. It's all about quick wins. This particular kind of community group is unhappy. We need to make them happy. That particular small group is unhappy. We need to make them happy. That particular staff member is unhappy. We need to make them happy. Whereas finite-minded churches tend to have a high pain threshold for long-term gains. That is, we don't mind things not being great whilst we prepare for a bigger win in the future. We can go through the pain through that. We'll take the emails, we'll take the criticism, because we know where we're going, and where we're going is better. You may not see it, but we do. Finite-minded churches tend to have a culture of risk aversion built into the decision makers. I wonder if you recognize that. Whereas infinite-minded churches tend to have risk built into the decision makers. You know, acceptable risk is always part of the conversation, not something that's gone wrong. And finally, success in a finite church is measured by influence within the borders of the church. And what I mean by that is, a finite church always wants to make sure that they have more control, authority, ability to influence their church members and regulars. That's what they're focused on, improving those power dynamics and structures. Whereas a finite-minded church is actually more interested in measuring success by influence beyond their borders, influence within the community. What do people think of our church? What relationships are we building up with the different organizations? Government organizations, community organizations, local schools. That is what a finite church is far more, an infinite church is far more interested in doing. Because longer term, it helps you play the game healthier and for longer than the finite-minded. Now, the reason that church plants are more adept at having an infinite mindset is because they are smaller and they start as underdogs. They start as underdogs. A church plant is not asking from the go, we want to be the biggest church in the city by next week. They're not asking from the go that we want to be the best. They're asking the question, how do we survive? How do we make payroll? How do we look after our families who've given up everything to move here? How do we just keep going? They want to play for as long as they can. Whereas more established churches, yeah, chances are you'll make budget for all of your core ministries. Can we do it again next year? It's a different mindset. The culture of plants is that their core people are made up with the most enthusiastic, highly committed members. They are risk takers in the core team. Otherwise, you wouldn't join a church plant. Which means actually the ability of the whole of the organization to pivot and take risks is always going to be built into the mindset of the decision makers, which is key. Whereas more established churches, you get people joining you for comfort, which means risk is a huge problem when it appears. Planters tend to be more open to new trends and disruptive ideas. You know, they've got nothing to lose. You know, they're not fighting so-and-so who's been in the church for 50 years and has always done it this way, which means they're able to move and be a bit more agile. But as you grow, as you become more established, history actually can become a real ball and chain for you. Planters tend to have a higher threshold for prioritizing the future plans over immediate comfort. Why? Because church plants are never comfortable at the start. It didn't start like that. It wasn't the goal. But more established churches, again, tend to drift towards, if we can make it the most comfortable experience for everyone possible, then that is the win. Comfort and future planning are not easy bedfellows. And normally in leadership, you will trade one for the other. And that is a challenge for us. And finally, plant teams know that they need to make inroads in the local community. They are more active in building relationships with schools, local communities. They're getting to know people in the coffee shops because they're wanting the church to be known because it's not known. And so they're investing energy. They don't have lots of people to try and steer, manage, corral, ranch. The larger churches, more established churches do, which means their energy is focused outward on that level of influence, whereas more established churches tend to put their resources inwards. A single member of staff with an outward-looking remit is not representative of the mindset of the larger church body. So, three things there to think through. Seeing your community with fresh eyes. See selective experiences as key. See church as an infinite game. Some of this stuff you'll be familiar with, but I'm just hoping that these are some of the lessons that we're learning at City Church through our continual investment in church plants, revitalizations, working with leaders, that we are benefiting from and wrestling with. And I'm hoping that actually some of the things that we've talked about this morning will be a good flavour for you, get you thinking, and actually lead to your own churches as you go back, readying yourself and positioning yourself to be far more effective going into the future. I hope that's been helpful. Good. That is it from me. We're going to take a few minutes to break, so we'll take 5